The 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is a clear upgrade, but is it worth the price? Our honest review of the DMG is coming up next. The red-headed stepchild of the D&D core rulebooks has gotten some significant upgrades as part of the 2024 revised 5th edition. But is that enough of a reason to shell out your hard-earned cash? Our honest review of the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is coming up, but first, hit those like and subscribe buttons to stay up to date on all your favorite tabletop news. With that business out of the way, the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is infinitely better than its predecessor and also makes some big changes to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Wizards of the Coast reorganized the new rulebook to make it new user-friendly and also fix some of the fatal flaws of the 2014 version. Now, that might seem like damning it with faint praise, but the book's refocus on how to actually run the game upgrades the Dungeon Master's Guide from a disappointing dust gatherer to an actual resource for Dungeon Masters. Now, historically, the Dungeon Master's Guide has always been kind of a weird book. It's less of a rulebook and more of a guide with suggestions and tips on how to build dungeons and combat encounters and everything else you'd expect to see in a typical D&D session. I guess that's why they call it the Dungeon Master's Guide and not the Dungeon Master's Rulebook. Now, while the 2014 iteration of the Dungeon Master's Guide had most of this information, it was, to be frank, a major dud. The book buried important tools and concepts in random chapters and focused on all the wrong parts of being a DM. Now, I could have forgiven all of that. After all, we know about some of the challenges that the early 2014 5th edition books kind of went through, but it was especially a failure given that 5th edition attracted more players than ever, and those players had nothing to go on with the Dungeon Master's Guide. Players turned to other resources such as actual plays or YouTube to learn how to run a game rather than turn to the actual resource meant to aid them in adventure and campaign prep. Now, if you've ever gotten mad at all the D&D YouTube channels that are out there, it's because of the failing of the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. That book sucked so badly, it created an entire cottage industry for how to actually run the game. One of the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide's biggest flaws was its organization. The book's early chapters focused on campaign prep and world building instead of how to actually run a game of Dungeons & Dragons, and that basically repeats one of the biggest flaws a new DM can make. The 2024 DMG corrects this error by focusing on the basics first and then expanding from that base of knowledge. The new book's first chapter is literally titled The Basics and focuses on the actual art of running both a D&D game and also managing a table of players. Now, this organization reflects a new reality of Dungeons & Dragons. This game attracts new players constantly, and many of them know next to nothing about the game at all and need some major help in learning how to be a good, or at least a functional, dungeon master. Now, after explaining what a DM does, the new Dungeon Master's Guide then moves on to how to plan a session of D&D. Now, each of the 3 pillars of play is explained, with combat given the most space because, at the end of the day, D&D is a combat-focused game, but social interactions and exploration are also explored in greater detail than what we saw in the 2014 DMG. Now, another major change here is a focus on, to be frank, the vibes of a campaign rather than adherence to a rigid set of rules. For instance, the new Dungeon Master's Guide provides numerous tips on how to build a campaign around the players rather than cater to the DM's specific version of a world. The social encounter section, it has some tips on how to incorporate PCs that don't have a high charisma stat so that they can feel like they're contributing when you're trying to argue with a king or convince a merchant to give them a discount on something. The rulebook also has a trove of useful tips on everything from how to keep an adventure from dragging and how to incorporate unexpectedly popular NPCs into a storyline. These tips are meant to remind DMs, especially new ones, that fun and camaraderie is more important than following the rules by the letter. Also, the 2024 DMG scrubs several poor passages and some poorly thought out concepts that really actively did harm to 5th edition. For instance, gone is the adventuring day, the recommendation that players face 6 to 8 combat encounters per adventuring day to fully use their resources. Let's face it, no one followed this. It was a waste of time, and DMs would get caught in trying to load up their sessions with all these useless combat encounters, which really didn't do much other than drag the game down. Instead, there's a recommendation that DMs use random encounters, which are still a useful part of D&D, to force players to tap into those precious spell slots and once per day abilities and to ratchet up the tension in their campaigns. Now, also, the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide also explicitly encourages DMs to hand out magic items. This comes complete with a handy chart, one of several such useful charts that are found in the new Dungeon Master's Guide, to keep track of how many magic items to give out during a campaign. Honestly, this fixes another flaw of the 2014 version, which weirdly kind of sort of implied that magic items were an optional part of Dungeons & Dragons. That was stupid. It was absolutely foolish not to encourage the distribution of magic items in a magic power fantasy game, especially since 1/3 of the Dungeon Master's Guide is filled with descriptions of magic items. Getting rid of these terrible suggestions are some of the biggest improvements made as part of this 2024 rewrite. Now, there are two standout new parts to the Dungeon Master's Guide that we should probably touch on. The first, of course, is the Greyhawk campaign setting guide that takes up about 30 pages in the new Dungeon Master's Guide. The book presents Greyhawk as an example of how to plan out a campaign world, with fixed points and destinations, but also lots of blank space for players to build out their own stories. Now, if you're expecting, like, the grand return of Greyhawk, this isn't that, but it's still a useful tool for new players and represents the first new Greyhawk material that we've gotten in like 20 or 30 years or something like that, unless you count, of course, rewrites of old classic adventures set in Greyhawk, such as Ghosts of Saltmarsh. That was entirely set in Greyhawk, but it didn't really talk about Greyhawk at all. The other new part is the Bastion system. It's a nice optional system, although I kind of think it's weird that it's in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So this is a new system that allows players, not the DM, to build out their own strongholds and populate it with various facilities and hirelings that can complete tasks during downtime. Now, Bastions serve two functions in a 2024 D&D campaign. They give players a toy to spend all their gold on, because players get lots of gold and don't have a lot to spend it on. Well, that gets fixed here. And also, it provides a tangible downtime activity to complete when players are in between adventures. Now, we've seen third-party material cover similar ground like this before, but I will say that the Bastion system jives with the whole less is more mentality that really drives 5th edition design philosophy at Wizards. Now, I really don't agree with putting this system inside a book for DMs instead of the player's handbook. It almost feels like an excuse to split new 5e material between rulebooks to force players to buy both. Luckily, Hasbro would never do such a thing, right? Now, the biggest strength of the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is that it provides an accessible entry point to organizing a game of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the starter sets are still the best entry point, period. That's never going to change, I don't think. Not even Wizards wants that to change. But this book bridges the gap between total newcomer and running a multi-year campaign in a homebrew world all of their own creation. However, I will say that the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide isn't a must-buy if you already have significant DM experience. Now, the DM Toolbox chapter is really a well-organized reference. It's one of the best DM toolboxes, I guess, that's what it's called, that we've ever seen for 5th edition or revised 5th edition. And the Bastion system, it's a decent subsystem, but those two things, not necessarily worth the $60. Likewise, it's nice to have a 5e version of Greyhawk, but it's only 30 pages of material, and there's nothing really new in there that you couldn't have already gotten from other Greyhawk material from previous editions. Now, my hope is that the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide finally gives Wizards an impetus to provide more resources to DMs in other books. One of my biggest frustrations as an always DM is that the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide was really the only official resource for DMs produced by Wizards. There's plenty of other good resources from third-party publishers, and I highly recommend that you still go and check them out. There's plenty of great ones. Kobold Press makes them, MCDM. And if you're looking for some new material on how to better your game, check that stuff out too. But outside of the odd chapter and expansion books like Xanathar's Guide to Everything, DM-focused material published by Wizards of the Coast, it's kind of rare and usually sprinkled in other adventures. And what we got in those adventures and campaigns, usually pretty disappointing. The new DM's Toolbox in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, it's leagues above anything else Wizards of the Coast has published for DMs. And it really should set a standard for how to present more DM toolsets in future rulebooks. Now, the biggest compliment I can give the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide is that it really should have existed when I started out as a DM. I made a lot of mistakes as a young DM, and I could have avoided some of them had I had this version of the Dungeon Master's Guide instead of whatever the heck I was using to plan out my campaigns. It's clear that the design team put a lot of time and care into successfully crafting a lasting resource for DMs, and in my personal opinion, they succeeded with flying colors. This book is such an upgrade to the 2014 version. You know how they talked about in the marketing for the 2024 Player's Handbook that, oh, this is such a clear upgrade, and it turned out to be better, but it wasn't like groundbreaking or earth-shattering. The Dungeon Master's Guide actually is just a totally different and so much better book than the 2014 version. Now, this is a massive upgrade over the previous Dungeon Master's Guide, even if it's not something most established D&D players will really need on their shelves. It's still probably something that you want to have, and it has a lot of good resources. So if you have the money, I'd probably pick this thing up instead of the Player's Handbook. So let us know if you're planning on picking up the new Dungeon Master's Guide, and be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and stay tuned for more videos about all things tabletop here on Above the Table.